BlackFacts.com presents BlackFacts Educational Series. The Underground Railroad. The Secret Routes. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses established in the United States during the early to mid-18th century. It was used by enslaved African Americans to primarily escape into free states and Canada. The scheme was assisted by abolitionists and others sympathetic to the cause of the escapees. Gateway to freedom. The enslaved who risked escape and those who aided them are also collectively referred to as the Underground Railroad. Various other routes led to Mexico, where slavery had been abolished, and to islands in the Caribbean that were not part of the slave trade. An earlier escape route running south toward Florida, then a Spanish possession, existed from the late 17th century until approximately 1790. However, the network now generally known as the Underground Railroad was formed in the late 18th century. It ran north and grew steadily until the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Abraham Lincoln. One estimate suggests that, by 1850, 100,000 enslaved people had escaped via the network. Political background. Under the original Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, officials from free states were required to assist slaveholders or their agents, who recaptured fugitives, but citizens and governments of many free states ignored the law, and the Underground Railroad thrived. Structure. The escape network was neither literally underground nor a railroad. Actual underground railroads did not exist until 1863. According to the Reverend John Rankin, it was so called because they who took passage on it disappeared from public view as really as if they had gone into the ground. After the fugitive slaves entered a depot on that road, no trace of them could be found. They were secretly passed from one depot to another until they arrived at a destination, where they were able to remain free. It was known as a railroad, using rail terminology such as stations and conductors, because that was the transportation system in use at the time. The Underground Railroad consisted of meeting points, secret routes, transportation, and safe houses, all of them maintained by abolitionist sympathizers and communicated by word of mouth. People escaping enslavement would move north along the route from one-way station to the next. Conductors came from various backgrounds, from freeborn blacks to white abolitionists. The role of free blacks was crucial. Without it, there would have been almost no chance for fugitives from slavery to reach freedom safely. Terminology. Members of the Underground Railroad often use specific terms based on the metaphor of the railway. People who helped enslaved people find the railroad were agents or shepherds. Guides were known as conductors. Hiding places were stations or way stations. Station masters hid enslaved people in their homes. People escaping slavery were referred to as passengers or cargo. Enslaved people would obtain a ticket. Similar to common gospel lore, the wheels would keep on turning. Financial benefactors of the railroad were known as stockholders. The railroad was often known as the Freedom Train or Gospel Train, which headed towards heaven or the Promised Land, as Canada was called at the time. Routes. To reduce the risk of infiltration, many people associated with the Underground Railroad knew only their part of the operation and not of the whole scheme. Conductors led or transported the fugitives from station to station. A conductor sometimes pretended to be enslaved to enter a plantation. Once a part of a plantation, the conductor would direct the runaways to the north. Enslaved people traveled at night, about 10 to 20 miles, 16 to 32 kilometers, to each station. They rested, and then a message was sent to the next station to let the station master know the escapees were on their way. Some Underground Railroad routes did not always go north. The routes to freedom for runaway slaves were to the Caribbean, in United States Western Territories, and Indian Territories. Some freedom seekers, escaped slaves, traveled south into Mexico for their freedom. There was a southwestern route on the Underground Railroad taken by the Black Seminoles from Florida into Mexico. Other Underground Railroad escape routes were the maroon communities. They consisted of wetlands or marshes where escaped slaves established their own independent communities. Harriet Tubman was a worker on the Underground Railroad who made 13 trips to the South, helping to free over 70 people. This helped Harriet Tubman gain the name Moses of her people. Travel conditions. Although the fugitives sometimes traveled on boat or train, they usually traveled on foot or by wagon in groups of 1 to 3 escapees. Some groups were considerably larger. Routes were often purposely indirect to confuse pursuers. The journey was often considered particularly difficult and dangerous for women or children. Enslaved women were rarely allowed to leave the plantation, making it harder for them to escape. Despite this, some women were successful. The same Harriet Tubman escaped slavery. Fugitives were not the only black people at risk from slave catchers. With demand for slaves high in the Deep South as cotton was developed, strong, healthy blacks in their prime working and reproductive years were seen and treated as highly valuable commodities. Both former slaves and free blacks were sometimes kidnapped and sold into slavery. Canada. Most former enslaved, reaching Canada by boat, settled in Ontario. More than 30,000 people were said to have escaped there via the network during its 20-year peak period. Upon arriving at their destinations, many fugitives were disappointed, as life in Canada was difficult. While not at risk from slave catchers due to being in a different country, discrimination was still widespread. Narrated by Timbuktu. To learn more about Black history, visit www.blackfacts.com.